The Bewildered Herd, How Fox Turns Confusion into Power. Brian T. Maxwell. Fox News's true innovation is the industrialization of bewilderment. It learned that confusion itself could be monetized, that a citizen unsure of what's real will cling to whoever sounds most certain. The result is dependence disguised as news. 2. The stakes of misinformation. It's 7 p.m. on a weeknight. An ordinary American sits down after work, dinner half finished, remote in hand. The television flickers to life in the familiar red and blue palette of Fox News. Breaking news blares across the screen, though nothing about the story is new. A solemn anchor warns of a border crisis, a crime wave, a war on freedom. In 60 minutes, the carousel of outrage will whirl through every corner of American life. Immigrants at the gates, cities in collapse, teachers corrupting children, bureaucrats scheming in the shadows. By the closing credits, the viewer's pulse has quickened. The outside world no longer feels complicated, it feels hostile, collapsing. That dread is no accident, it's the business model. Fox learned long ago that fear glues attention, and attention pays. The network keeps viewers suspended between two emotions, fear and fury, while selling relief in the form of certainty. Between commercials for reverse mortgages and patriotic supplements, a portrait of America takes shape. A nation perpetually on the brink, besieged by enemies foreign and domestic, rescued only by those who tell it like it is. The language is moral, not factual, the tone is sermon, not news. And the effect is cumulative. Confusion becomes the baseline emotion. Certainty, the illusion that someone somewhere still knows what's true, becomes the product. By bedtime, the viewer may not recall the specifics of the stories aired, but the emotional residue remains: distrust, anger, isolation. The world feels less knowable, less stable. And that is precisely the point. Democracy requires a public capable of distinguishing reality from rhetoric, evidence from assertion. Fox News thrives by dissolving those distinctions. It does not simply misinform, it manufactures a worldview in which everything is suspect except itself. Fox's true innovation wasn't bias, it was the industrialization of bewilderment. The network discovered that confusion could be turned into currency, that uncertainty could be sold like any other commodity. The formula was simple. If people could be made to doubt everything, they would eventually depend on the one voice that promised certainty. In this marketplace of emotion, truth lost its value, conviction became the only tender that spent. The more bewildered the audience, the more loyal it grew. Confusion breeding devotion, skepticism replaced by faith in the familiar glow of the screen. By the time the last segment fades and the lights click off, the viewer may not recall a single headline. What lingers instead is a residue, a subtle film of anxiety, distrust, and exhaustion. The world seems less solid, its edges blurred. That corrosion of clarity is the point, not the accident. The capacity to discern fact from theater, evidence from emotion, is slowly stripped away. Fox doesn't merely distort reality, it rearranges the conditions of knowing itself. The network becomes both the arsonist and the fire marshal, creating confusion, then selling relief from it. When bewilderment becomes habitual, democracy begins to deform. A citizen uncertain of what's real cannot deliberate. They can only react. Reflex replaces reason. Belonging replaces judgment. The audience no longer weighs claims but performs loyalty, responding to cues, not evidence. Fox did not stumble upon this audience by chance. It built it carefully through rhythm and repetition, spectacle and fear. Each night's outrage prepares the ground for the next. Over time, the individual becomes part of a mana-GED population, still convinced they are thinking freely even as their doubts are pre-scripted. This is the quiet triumph of modern misinformation. Not that people are persuaded to believe lies, but that they lose the habit of believing anything at all. In the end, the damage isn't measured in false claims, but in the hollowing out of trust itself. What collapses is not merely truth, it is the public's faith that truth can be known. Lippmann's Bewildered Herd, and the need for honest guides. A century ago, Walter Lippmann, journalist, philosopher, and one of democracy's sharpest diagnosticians, peered into the early machinery of modern media and saw the crisis that would define the next 100 years. The industrial age had given rise to information empires, telegraphs, wire services, and mass circulation newspapers that could reach millions in a single morning. Yet even then, he recognized a paradox. The more information societies produced, the less individuals could possibly absorb. The world had become too vast, too specialized, too mediated for any citizen to navigate on instinct alone. "We do not first see and then define," Lippmann wrote. "We define first and then see." In other words, our grasp of reality is filtered through interpretation, through editors, teachers, leaders, and now algorithms. These intermediaries don't just report on the world. They build the mental architecture through which we perceive it. Lippmann called "constructed to make an unmanageable world observed," is far too vast for any one mind to grasp that architecture, a pseudo-environment, a mental map feel navigable. Modern life, he in full. We depend on patterns, narratives, and trusted interpreters to make sense of what experience. No individual can personally confirm the solvency of a bank, the progress of a distant war, or the reliability of a scientific claim. We must therefore rely on intermediaries, institutions of trust, to do that work for us. When those intermediaries honor their civic duty, they become the translators of complexity. They test information before transmitting it, place it in proportion, and give citizens the bearings they need to tell truth from rumor, urgency from hysteria, fact from political theater. In doing so, they make self-government possible, lies beyond our direct simplifications, on. But when those same intermediaries betray that duty, when they trade clarity for influence or accuracy for outrage, the pseudo-environment mutates from a map into a maze. Illusion replaces explanation. Information ceases to illuminate and begins to perform. The press becomes not a window but a stage, and the audience mistakes spectacle for substance. What was meant to orient citizens instead disorients them. The map that once guided us now confines us, its boundaries drawn by those who profit from confusion. This was Lippmann's great warning, that a self-governing people, cut off from honest interpreters, would drift toward what he called a managed democracy, a society where public opinion is not deliberated but manufactured. He saw the danger not in the ignorance of the public, but in its dependence. The bewildered herd, as he famously described it, was not composed of fools or fanatics. It was made up of ordinary citizens doing their best to survive a deluge of information they could never fully verify. The problem was not capacity but overload. The farmer, the teacher, the shopkeeper, all were bound to rely on others to explain the world beyond their fields and towns. Democracy, therefore, stands or falls on the integrity of those intermediaries. The public will always be led, inevitable in any complex society. The question, the moral question, was never whether people would be led, but for whom, toward what truth, and for whose benefit. In Lippmann's view, the ethical intermediary stands as a translator between the vast machinery of the modern world and the ordinary citizen struggling to interpret it. Their task is both intellectual and moral, to simplify without deforming, to clarify without inflaming. They are the cartographers of the public mind, turning the noise of events into coherent understanding. The responsible interpreter draws light from complexity rather than heat from conflict. Their allegiance is not to faction, but to truth itself, to the difficult, unglamorous labor of explanation that keeps democracy grounded in reality rather than in spectacle. But Lippmann also saw a darker temptation shadowing this vocation. There would always be those who found profit, political or financial, in confusion. To such actors, public bewilderment was not a wound to heal, but a resource to mine. Once intermediaries discover that fear sells faster than fact, that outrage outperforms accuracy, the moral center of the press begins to rot. Information ceases to orient the citizen and starts to steer them. The pseudo-environment meant as a guide becomes a trap. A society deprived of honest translators loses its confidence in what is real. In that vacuum, myth rushes in to fill the silence that truth once occupied. Persuasion hardens into manipulation, and debate gives way to belief. That threshold, the line between guiding and deceiving, is the defining fault line of the modern information age. Every generation redraws it, and every abuse of it weakens the foundations of civic trust. Those who shape public perception wield power not merely over opinion but over the very conditions of citizenship, over what people believe they know, and thus over what they can imagine choosing. Lippmann argued that this interpretive power carries a sacred duty to build an environment in which self-government can breathe, one structured by clarity, proportion, and good faith. When the press forsakes that duty, when it constructs instead an atmosphere of fear, fantasy, or perpetual crisis, it stops serving the public and begins to rule it. The moment journalism trades its compass for a spotlight, democracy loses its map. Moral purpose, that defines the Fox News model. Where Lippmann warned that the pseudo-environment could become an instrument of control, Fox perfected it and turned it into an industry. The network built a perpetual motion machine of fear, crises without end, villains without faces, saviors without accountability. Every story is a battlefield, every headline a moral emergency. The result is not illumination but dependency, a public kept in permanent suspense, oscillating between panic and devotion. In Lippmann's terms, Fox took the bewildered herd and found a way to monetize its confusion. What was once democracy's greatest vulnerability, its need for interpreters, has been transformed into a revenue stream. The network's business model is the very pathology Lippmann foresaw, the manufacture of spectacle in place of understanding, emotion in place of evidence, loyalty in place of thought. Its purpose is not to clarify the world, but to keep it unstable, ensuring the audience forever looks to the same source for meaning. Thus begins the story that follows. The bewildered herd of the 21st century does not wander by accident, it is herded, systematically, lucratively, and with the language of patriotism as its leash. The sections ahead trace how confusion becomes fear, how fear becomes obedience, and how a democracy, once proud of its reason, is taught to mistake agitation for awareness. What Lippmann described as a crisis of interpretation has become, in the age of 24-hour cable, an empire of confusion. 5. Fox manufactures confusion, not clarity. Fox News doesn't merely inherit a confused audience, it manufactures one. Confusion isn't the residue of its journalism, it's the architecture of its success. The network's method is formulaic, select, sensationalize, and smother. It selects the fragment that inflames, sensationalizes it into a national crisis, and then smothers the context that might calm it down. A single image becomes a parable, an outlier becomes a trend. A rumor, repeated often enough, becomes a question worth asking. The transformation is seamless, information turns into drama, drama into ideology, and ideology into loyalty. What results is not news in any civic sense of the term, but a televised pseudo-environment, Lippmann's nightmare brought to life, where adrenaline displaces accuracy and outrage masquerades as awareness. The system runs on tension. A viewer soothed is a viewer lost. In this engineered reality, the omissions are as powerful as the distortions. Fox isolates the fragment that stings and amputates the context that would explain it. Complexity, the essence of truth, is treated as contamination. If a story cannot be made to fit the preferred narrative, it is stripped of proportion until it does. A brief rise in crime in one city becomes proof of American decline, while national data showing crime trending downward vanishes. A professor's provocative comment becomes a symbol of anti-American academia, while the larger, nuanced debate that produced it is cut away. The result is an emotional monoculture, a reality curated for anger. The brilliance and the danger lie in how familiar it all feels. Each story has just enough fact to appear credible, just enough exaggeration to feel urgent. Viewers come to trust the rhythm of alarm, a world perpetually on the brink, requiring constant vigilance and, by implication, constant viewership. By cherry-picking the incendiary and burying the temperate, Fox has constructed not a mirror of reality but a stage set. lit, edited, and scored for moral theater. It's a world that rewards suspicion, punishes doubt, and keeps its audience forever on edge, forever waiting for the next outrage to confirm what the last one implied. In this environment, confusion isn't the debris left behind by bad journalism. It's the goal. Certainty is rationed, clarity withheld, because the network's economy depends on agitation. The product isn't information, it's dependence. On Fox, the atmosphere is permanently set to code red. Every broadcast unfolds like the prelude to national collapse, every hour marketed as the most important in America's history. There is always a siege underway, an invasion at the border, a war on faith, a plot against freedom, a constitutional emergency that only vigilance and viewership can repel. The rhythm of alarm is deliberate. It builds an emotional dependency. To stop watching feels like letting your guard down while the country burns. This choreography of crisis serves a deeper function than entertainment. It turns anxiety into a civic posture. Fox's tone is not merely urgent, it is apocalyptic, conditioning audiences to feel perpetually under attack and perpetually righteous in their fear. Each story becomes a moral battle in which calm is complicity and outrage is virtue. Psychologists have long noted that sustained fear and anger narrow perception and short-circuit analysis. The brain, flooded with adrenaline, shifts from reason to reaction. Fox weaponizes that reflex. In a state of constant peril, audiences don't compare facts, they brace for the next blow. Proportion, the soul of journalism, vanishes in this theater. A pandemic can't remain a public health challenge. It must be cast as tyranny in disguise, a plot to control freedom. A migrant caravan hundreds of miles away can't be a slow-moving humanitarian crisis. It must be an invading army marching on the gates. Every complex issue is flattened into an existential struggle, every disagreement into betrayal. By keeping its audience suspended in fight or flight mode, the network ensures that critical thought never finds room to breathe. Fear crowds out curiosity, indignation drowns deliberation. In that oxygen-starved atmosphere, Fox achieves its real victory. It replaces understanding with vigilance, transforming democratic attention, the capacity to think, weigh, and choose, into a kind of patriotic panic. The audience is left exhausted but loyal, not informed but inflamed, their nervous systems tuned to the frequency of permanent emergency. Perhaps most insidiously, Fox doesn't just mislead, it disorients. The network floods the informational zone with so much speculation, innuendo, and contradiction that truth itself begins to lose shape. One program floats a rumor under the guise of just asking questions. The next segment stages a theatrical rebuttal, not to the rumor itself, but to a distorted caricature of the criticism it provoked. Hours later, another host introduces a fresh, unverified development, leaving viewers unsure of what changed or even what the original claim was. By the end of the news cycle, fact, half-truth, and fabrication have been mixed into an indistinguishable haze. The effect is not confusion as a mistake, it's confusion as method. This tactic is devastatingly effective. In a world saturated with contradiction, the human mind craves coherence. Faced with many conflicting versions of reality, people often retreat to the only stable compass left, emotion. Fox exploits that vulnerability by replacing clarity with identity. When viewers can no longer trust the news, they are invited to trust. 7. The network itself, to cling not to verified information but to a familiar sense of grievance, a shared sense of who is on their side. The more chaotic the facts become, the more comforting the tribe feels. Propaganda in the modern age no longer depends on persuading people to believe one grand lie. The real innovation lies in breaking their confidence that truth exists at all. Once that confidence erodes, the ground of democratic discourse collapses. Fox has mastered this strategy. Each contradictory headline, each performative correction, each speculative monologue compounds the same message: you can't really know what's real, so you might as well believe us. Whether the subject is an election, a pandemic, or a protest, the conclusion is always the same. Certainty is impossible, but loyalty is safe. The network's power lies in this corrosion of epistemic trust. When people no longer believe in facts, they become governable through emotion alone. Outrage replaces understanding, belonging substitutes for verification, and skepticism is redirected not toward power, but toward any institution, journalistic, scientific, or civic, that might challenge Fox's authority. In that informational fog, viewers are not simply misinformed, they are disoriented, dependent, and primed to absorb whatever comes next. It is a form of soft control more durable than censorship, a democracy anesthetized not by silence, but by noise. In the end, Fox has built something far more sophisticated and more corrosive than a news network. It has constructed an atmosphere, a self-sustaining fog that blurs the line between crisis and reality until the two become indistinguishable. Every flicker of outrage, every truncated headline, every contradiction that masquerades as debate feeds the same psychological engine: anxiety without comprehension, conviction without evidence. The network's success lies not in persuading viewers of a particular argument, but in exhausting their capacity for discernment. The more noise it creates, the more dependent the audience becomes on Fox itself to navigate the chaos that Fox has manufactured. This is not journalism designed to illuminate, it is programming engineered to keep citizens in a constant state of reactive confusion, a public so overstimulated that agitation begins to feel like awareness. Each segment plays a dual role, stoking anger while soothing it with certainty. The viewer is led from alarm to reassurance and back again in a loop that mimics clarity but delivers only emotional fatigue. It's a theater of perpetual crisis where comprehension is replaced by loyalty and doubt is recast as disloyalty. In this space, belief is no longer a matter of evidence but of belonging. What Walter Lippmann feared a century ago, a democracy governed by citizens too bewildered to judge for themselves, has arrived, not by accident, but by design. Fox has turned his warning into a business model. It has perfected the technique of informational smog, flooding the public sphere with enough heat, volume, and velocity that quiet reasoning can't breathe. By converting journalism into spectacle, it transforms civic life into something closer to sport, a contest of feelings where the scoreboard is measured in outrage. This fog serves a strategic purpose. When citizens are perpetually unsettled, power no longer needs to justify itself, it merely needs to perform decisiveness. The more disoriented the public becomes, the more appealing the illusion of order appears. A nation kept on edge will mistake noise for strength, simplicity for truth, and authority for competence. And so Fox's fog is not an accident of excess, it is the very substance of control. The result is not an informed electorate, but a managed population, angry enough to stay engaged, afraid enough to stay obedient, and loyal enough to never look away. It is a democracy running on adrenaline and illusion, its citizens caught in the glow of constant emergency, convinced that vigilance is freedom even as the light blinds them to what is real. From confusion to obedience, how fear becomes loyalty. Fox doesn't merely inform its viewers, it conditions them. The network's power lies not in what it teaches, but in what it trains the mind to feel. Once confusion has settled over the audience like fog, Fox channels that disorientation into something sharper, fear. And fear, in Fox's design, is not the conclusion of its programming, it's the foundation. It is the first stage in a conversion ritual that turns uncertainty into conviction, conviction into identity, and identity into obedience. The process is gradual but exact. Step by step, the anxious viewer is reshaped from observer into participant, from audience member into disciple. What begins as the search for information becomes the defense of a faith. Each broadcast reinforces the transformation. The rhetoric of danger is elevated to ceremony, every segment a sermon, every anchor a preacher. Of perpetual threat. The cadence is devotional, enemies are named, purity is affirmed, and loyalty is tested. Words like freedom, faith, and America are invoked not to explain but to sanctify, turning political grievance into moral commandment. The viewer's anxiety becomes a kind of worship, a ritualized vigilance against an ever-present evil that only the network can reveal. With each repetition, civic curiosity is stripped away and replaced with emotional reflex. Facts are no longer measured by accuracy, but by allegiance. Truth itself is recast as a matter of trust. Do you believe us, or do you believe them? Fear, once kindled, becomes Fox's most reliable instrument. The network keeps up a relentless percussion of crisis, its headlines pounding like war drums, its tone one of siege. Every hour brings a new alert, a border under attack, a city lost to chaos, a government infiltrated by traitors, schools corrupted by radicals. The threats change daily, but the feeling is constant, a sense that the country is slipping away, that safety is already compromised, that the hour is always late. For the viewer, the instinct is primal, to seek safety, to find an enemy. Fox provides both. It names the culprits and frames the camera. Immigrants become an invasion. Protesters become terrorists. Professors are indoctrinators. Bureaucrats are deep state conspirators. Each night's broadcast reaffirms that the crisis is total and the enemies are everywhere. The genius of the format is its rotation. When one villain loses potency, another steps in. The cycle never stops because fear cannot be allowed to rest. It is self-renewing, each outrage clearing the stage for the next, each night's panic serving as proof that the previous one was justified. Underneath the noise, a structure emerges. The viewer learns that chaos is the natural state of the world, and that the only bulwark against collapse is constant vigilance, meaning constant viewership. In that ecosystem, to turn away from Fox is not just to change the channel, it is to abandon the tribe. Fear becomes belonging, and belonging becomes obedience. Through repetition, Fox transforms anxiety into ideology and converts citizens into sentinels who mistake agitation for awareness and allegiance for truth. Once a viewer has been primed by confusion and fear, Fox offers them a form of relief, a new identity, radiant with purpose and moral certainty. The network extends a seductive invitation. You are not just an observer of chaos, you are part of a righteous remnant standing against it. Through constant repetition and emotional reinforcement, Fox flatters its audience into believing they are the real America, the authentic, embattled core of the nation besieged by corrupt elites, predatory outsiders, and decadent urban radicals. In this narrative, every hardship becomes proof of virtue, every criticism confirmation that the faithful are being persecuted for their righteousness. Over time, news ceases to be a neutral transmission of events and becomes a mission, a moral struggle masquerading as reportage. Viewers stop consuming information and start performing loyalty. They are no longer citizens assessing facts, but soldiers enlisted in a permanent culture war. Each segment becomes a battlefront, defending faith, freedom, and common sense against whatever enemy the day provides. The framing is deliberately elastic, shifting from immigrants to professors, from protesters to bureaucrats, yet always structured around the same emotional spine that chaos is encroaching and only unwavering allegiance can hold it back. This transformation is powerful because it gratifies two opposite impulses at once. It flatters the audience's sense of victimhood. You have been betrayed by the elites, while inflating their importance. You are the only ones who can save the country. Fox fuses grievance with grandeur, turning resentment into identity and identity into duty. Once this new self-concept takes root, fear becomes fuel and belonging becomes armor. The viewer's anxiety is alchemized into purpose. What was once passive consumption of media hardens into a civic creed, reinforced nightly by the spectacle of enemies at the gates and allies in the studio. The network's genius lies in converting emotional volatility into communal coherence. Fear, which isolates individuals, is redirected into a shared sense of siege and solidarity. In Fox's universe, the viewer is never alone in their dread. They are part of a vast fellowship of the wronged. That collective identity becomes self-policing. To doubt the narrative is to endanger the group. To question the mission is to betray the tribe. Within that moral economy, loyalty becomes virtue, and skepticism becomes sin. From this constructed identity emerges obedience, the kind that does not question, does not doubt, and does not look its leaders in the eye. Once the viewer accepts that they are a soldier in an information war, Civic reasoning gives way to martial loyalty. The news no longer instructs, it commands. Fox replaces the messy work of democratic thought, the weighing of evidence, the tolerance of uncertainty, with a simpler creed: stand with the team, defend the line, never break formation. The expectation is not understanding, but compliance. To ask why becomes an act of rebellion. To hesitate becomes betrayal. Doubt, once the engine of reason, is redefined as disloyalty. The network enforces this discipline through a continuous choreography of loyalty tests. Every broadcast carries the implicit demand: prove that you belong. A Republican who questions Fox's framing becomes a Reno, a sellout, or a traitor to the cause, publicly shamed with theatrical contempt. Governors, senators, or commentators who deviate from the approved narrative are swiftly recast as villains, mocked, exiled, or erased from the airwaves. Even mild dissent is portrayed as collusion with the enemy. The viewer, watching this spectacle of humiliation, absorbs the lesson instinctively. Hesitation is punished, conformity rewarded. The moral geography of Fox's universe allows no neutral ground. There are only believers and betrayers, patriots and heretics, insiders and enemies. Over time, this ritual discipline becomes self-sustaining. Obedience no longer needs to be demanded, it becomes reflexive. Viewers learn to preemptively censor doubt, to anticipate the boundaries of acceptable thought. What once required enforcement now operates through instinct and belonging. Fox achieves submission not through coercion, but through communion, by surrounding its audience with a chorus of voices repeating the same approved reality until anything outside that harmony feels suspect, even threatening. Experts, independent journalists, dissenting conservatives, all are recast as infiltrators, agents of the deep state, or tools of liberal media corruption. The network teaches its followers to trust only those within the circle of faith, and to treat every other source of information as hostile propaganda. It is a closed ecosystem of belief, reinforced by social identity and sustained by the fear of isolation. At the top of this hierarchy of devotion stands the figure Fox crowns as the indispensable savior, the symbolic general in this perpetual war. In recent years, that figure has been Donald Trump. He is not portrayed merely as a politician, but as the embodiment of national survival, the warrior king defending real Americans from the encroaching tide of chaos. Fox does not cover him, it consecrates him. Every scandal becomes a test of faith, every criticism proof of conspiracy, every defeat an act of martyrdom. Through repetition and reverence, he is transformed into something larger than a man, a vessel for grievance, a living myth of protection and defiance. 10. But Trump is not the point. He is the placeholder. The machinery would function with any charismatic figure willing to perform the role. The mechanics of devotion, the creation of crisis, the offering of salvation, the suppression of dissent, remain the same. Fox has built a system that can attach its obedience to any savior it chooses, so long as that savior keeps the audience afraid enough to follow and flattered enough to believe they are leading. The formula is elegant in its simplicity and ruthless in its effectiveness. First, construct an enemy, real, exaggerated, or entirely invented, so immense and menacing that no ordinary leader appears equal to the task. This enemy must be shapeless enough to adapt to any moment and vast enough to demand constant vigilance, a faceless deep state, a horde of foreign invaders, an amorphous army of radicals bent on destroying the nation. It must feel omnipresent, capable of infiltrating every school, every election, every institution. The genius of this construction is that the threat can never be disproven, only deferred. Every failure, scandal, or policy defeat simply becomes proof that the enemy is stronger than imagined, and that more loyalty is required to defeat it. Then comes the reveal, the savior. The chosen figure, Fox's anointed hero, is presented as the sole bulwark against chaos, the only person capable of confronting the menace that the network itself helped conjure. His authority is framed as destiny, his defiance as courage, his anger as proof of righteousness. He alone tells it like it is, and therefore he alone can lead the faithful out of the storm. The narrative completes its loop, the network invents a crisis, installs a hero to confront it, and then binds its audience to that hero's survival as if their own fate were tied to his. In this worldview, doubt is not a sign of critical thought, it is heresy. Skepticism becomes betrayal. Compromise is recast as surrender. The audience learns that their worth is measured not by their reasoning, but by their loyalty. To question is to defect. To falter is to aid the enemy. Propaganda operates here with surgical precision. It first builds terror and helplessness, then offers salvation, but only through absolute obedience. The cycle sustains itself through emotional dependency, the fear that to stop believing would mean facing chaos alone. This is propaganda's oldest and most enduring trick. Manufacture a crisis that cannot be solved, then sell the illusion of rescue embodied in a single man. Every battle must seem existential, every threat absolute, so that dissent feels not just mistaken but immoral. Within that logic, the leader becomes indispensable precisely because the danger never ends. He promises safety, but only on one condition: that you never stray, never question, and never imagine that another path might exist. Fox's brand of patriotism is not a creed rooted in principle, but a choreography of loyalty performed on cue. It cloaks itself in the flag, but strips the flag of meaning, converting civic devotion into a ritual of obedience. Love of country becomes indistinguishable from love of the tribe, and the tribe, in turn, is defined not by shared ideals, but by submission to a single figure. Under this worldview, patriotism is not something one practices through participation or conscience. It is something one proves through allegiance. The measure of loyalty is no longer what you stand for, but whom you stand behind. Fox's hosts construct this creed night after night. Real Americans, viewers are told, defend the leader against his enemies, the mob, the deep state, the liberal elite. Skepticism about his conduct is framed as complicity with the opposition, and criticism from within is branded as treachery. Even the mildest questions are treated as betrayal. To ask for evidence is to aid the enemy. To appeal to law or decency is to reveal weakness. The nation becomes a stage upon which loyalty must be constantly performed, a morality play in which defiance is equated with sin. The result is an inverted patriotism where obedience masquerades as courage and silence in the face of wrongdoing is redefined as strength. This inversion is subtle but devastating. It transforms democratic vigilance, the duty to question those in power, into a moral failing. Where genuine patriotism once demanded skepticism in the name of liberty, Fox's version demands faith in the name of security. It recasts submission as solidarity and conflates the health of the republic with the preservation of the tribe. By sanctifying conformity, it turns moral conscience into a liability. The flag becomes less a symbol of shared citizenship than a banner under which to march in defense of the infallible. The transformation that follows is not totalitarian in the classical sense. There are no uniforms, no parades, no decrees, but its psychological reach is absolute. The once pluralistic public that tuned in for perspective becomes a single echo chamber speaking in unison, its members convinced they alone embody the nation's will. Curiosity curdles into creed. Disagreement feels like betrayal. Through repetition and ritual affirmation, confusion is transmuted into 11. Conviction. Viewers find solace not in understanding but in belonging, and belonging soon demands obedience. The trade is quiet but fateful. They surrender skepticism in exchange for the illusion of safety. In that exchange, security for doubt, democracy loses its most vital reflex, the capacity to question. A society that cannot interrogate what it hears cannot govern what it becomes. When citizens mistake obedience for unity, they cease to be participants in self-rule and instead become the audience to its undoing. And in such a nation, the loudest voice in the room, whoever masters the noise, will always be mistaken for the truth. Real policy harm, when a bewildered public can be led anywhere. The danger of Fox's bewilderment model isn't theoretical, it governs everyday life. A confused, compliant audience doesn't just warp conversation, it warps the republic. When millions are trained to feel before they think, fear displaces reason and loyalty takes the place of scrutiny. Power then concentrates quietly and is exercised recklessly. A misinformed public stops acting as a constitutional check and starts functioning as an instrument. Narrative controllers can steer consent toward policies that, under calmer or better informed conditions, Americans would recognize as hostile to their own values. You can watch the mechanism at work. Even developments that should pierce the bubble barely register once filtered through it. Findings that would normally trigger national alarm are reframed, minimized, or buried under fresher outrage. The point isn't to win an argument on the merits, it's to keep the audience moving so quickly from crisis to crisis that nothing ever lands. In that churn, concrete evidence bounces off a shield of cultivated doubt, and accountability dissolves into just another story. This is where the damage leaves the screen and enters law, governance, and daily life. Fox's perception politics, permanent crisis, moral panic, and the elevation of toughness over legality conditions viewers to applaud what they once would have condemned. Presidents who bypass Congress are recast as decisive. Troops in American streets are sold as restoring order. Voting safeguards rolled back in the name of fairness are celebrated as integrity. Whole categories of people, immigrants, protesters, journalists, are narrated into enemies, making extraordinary measures feel not only acceptable, but necessary. What begins as rhetoric becomes policy. What begins as confusion ends as consent. To see the stakes clearly, follow the pattern into specific arenas where this fog translates into force. Start with power itself, war powers, and the ritual celebration of strength, where spectacle turns constitutional caution into a punchline and unilateral action into a virtue. From there, watch how the same script narrows the electorate, defends gerrymanders, and converts law and order into theater. The result across domains is the same: a weaker Congress, a thinner demos, and a more centralized, less accountable government. In other words, the bewildered herd isn't just watching the show anymore, it's living inside its consequences. 12. War powers and toughness over law. Fox's constant drumbeat of emergency has quietly redrawn the borders of lawful power. Night after night, restraint is framed as weakness and unilateral force as virtue. When federal tactical teams rolled into American cities in 2025 under the banner of law and order, Fox celebrated the posture itself. Armored vehicles as aesthetics of strength, raids as proof of resolve, while skimming past the basic legality. Multiple federal courts, from Oregon to Illinois, issued orders curbing elements of those deployments on constitutional grounds, including violations of long-standing limits, such as the Posse Comitatus Act, 18 U.S.C. SS 1385, which bars using Title X active duty forces for domestic policing. Exceptions exist, but they are narrow. The Insurrection Act, 10 U.S.C. SSSS 251 to 255, or National Guard units operating under state authority, Title 32. None of that nuance made the screen. Injunctions became technicalities. Statutory boundaries became red tape. The missing questions are the ones that anchor a republic. Were the personnel title 10 forces or guard units under a governor? If guard, were they federally federalized, and on what statutory basis? What mission support, if any, was authorized under DoD's limited law enforcement assistance authorities, information sharing, logistics, training, as opposed to prohibited direct participation in searches, seizures, or arrests? Which agency had operational lead, DOJ, DHS, or DOD, and under what memorandum of agreement? These are not academic quibbles. They are the difference between policing within law and policing outside it. Fox flattened them all into a single image: power in motion. The same substitution of theater for law played out overseas. Article 1, Section 8 vests Congress with the power to declare war, The War Powers Resolution requires the President to notify Congress within 48 hours of introducing U.S. forces into hostilities, and to terminate those hostilities within 60 days, absent authorization. Yet, when the administration announced it would treat foreign drug cartels as military targets, effectively opening a new theater of armed conflict without a specific AUMF, Fox responded with primetime ovations. In October 2025, the president even touted covert CIA operations and lethal strikes on suspected traffickers near Venezuela's coast. That posture raises precise legal tests that never reach the chyron. Was there a President EAL finding under Title 50 for covert action? Were the congressional intelligence leaders properly notified? Under international law, did the operation satisfy necessity and proportionality? And did it respect the UN Charter's bar on the use of force against another state's territorial integrity absent consent or self-defense? By design, these guardrails are slow. They force justification, documentation, and debate, the unglamorous machinery that keeps a commander-in-chief inside the Constitution. Fox recodes that slowness as cowardice. Taking the gloves off becomes a moral imperative. Statutory process becomes evidence of decadence. What gets lost is the structural cost. Blurring the line between civilian law enforcement and military force at home turns exceptional tools into routine options. Treating transnational crime as a war to be waged by executive fiat abroad normalizes conflict without congressional ownership. Both moves bypass the deliberative checks that prevent a single office from defining both the emergency and the cure. Under calmer, better-informed conditions, Americans instinctively see the danger in treating every problem like a battlefield. Battlefields have enemies, not neighbors. They reward domination, not law. But a public marinated in Fox's nightly theater of peril has been trained to crave the spectacle of power. Each display of unilateral action is sold as protection from chaos, when in reality it is the slow, quiet surrender of self, government dressed up as strength. 13. Elections and voter power. A healthy democracy draws its strength from inclusion. Every eligible citizen counted, every ballot weighted the same, every district drawn to reflect people rather than protect politicians. Fox works the opposite angle. Night after night, it recasts basic participation, restoring the Voting Rights Act, expanding early voting, securing mail ballots, as a partisan plot to rig the system. The vocabulary is familiar: ballot harvesting, illegals voting, chaos at the polls. The effect is to turn ordinary access into alleged subversion, so the audience learns to fear their neighbors' votes, instead of defending their neighbors' rights. When the Supreme Court took up major redistricting cases in 2025, including Alexander v. South Carolina NAACP and the Louisiana Section 2 case, Fox largely skipped the stakes for minority representation. Viewers were told that laws forbidding racial gerrymandering forced states to draw districts for minorities as if the Voting Rights Act were a quota machine rather than an anti-discrimination safeguard. That framing doesn't just misinform, it weaponizes resentment. People who already feel ignored are coached to see someone else's equal access as a threat to their own. Here's the real math of that distortion. Without strong Section 2 protections and independent map drawing, time-tested tactics return with a vengeance, cracking communities, splitting cohesive Black or Latino neighborhoods across several districts so none can elect a candidate of choice, and packing them, stuffing those voters into as few districts as possible to waste surplus votes. You can preordain outcomes before a single ballot is cast. It's political monopoly making by cartography, and it turns elections into a formality. Fox then completes the loop by sanctifying the result. Skewed maps are praised as keeping communities together or reflecting the will of the state, while the people whose votes were diluted are told their objections are partisan gamesmanship. In that moral inversion, reform becomes cheating, and gerrymandering becomes stability. Viewers are nudged to cheer the shrinking of their own power because it looks like their side is winning. The human consequences are not abstract. When representation is rigged, constituent services drift, policy priorities harden around incumbents, and a generation of elections is contested on tilted ground. Voters in cracked districts learn that showing up doesn't change outcomes. Cynicism sets in. Turnout falls. The maps look even more justified. That spiral is the point, not the accident. It's how a vibrant, argumentative public gets managed into a smaller, safer electorate. The antidote is not complicated, but it is moral as much as procedural. Tell the truth about what these fights are really about. Protect access across the board. IDs that don't exclude, mail voting that's secure and convenient, early voting that matches real lives, police line drawing with transparent standards and independent commissions. And refuse the story that someone else's ballot steals yours. Equal access isn't a favor granted to them. It's the condition that keeps all of us free to fire the people who govern us. 14. The gerrymandering defense. Fox treats the scandal of partisan map-making the way a defense attorney treats a guilty client, not with evidence, but with misdirection. When critics show how legislatures in places like North Carolina, Texas, or Georgia carve districts to insulate incumbents and lock in one-party control, the network rarely engages the substance. It waves away the math and reaches for a shrug. Both sides do it. Scale and intent disappear, only the cynicism remains. That shrug is the whole move. By collapsing egregious and marginal cases into the same bucket, Fox replaces judgment with fatalism. A wildly contorted map that preordains outcomes is equated with a messy but competitive map. A decade-long plan to dilute a minority community's vote is treated as identical to a single oddly shaped district in a blue state. Viewers are nudged to conclude that reform is naive, that nothing matters, that every complaint is just partisan theater. Here's what the slogan hides. Gerrymandering is not a vibe, it is a set of techniques with measurable effects. Cracking splits cohesive can elect a preferred representative. Packing stuffs those same voters, communities across several districts so none into one or two supermajority districts to waste their surplus votes. The seat vote curve bends. One party's candidates win lopsided landslides in a few districts, while the other party wins many districts by modest margins, delivering a durable seat bonus unrelated to public preference. Responsiveness, the degree to which seats change when votes change, flattens. Elections stop translating voter sentiment into representation. That is the point. Fox then rebrands the result. Maps that neuter competition are praised as stability. Districts engineered to marginalize dissent are sold as keeping communities intact. Lawsuits and independent commission proposals are cast as power grabs. The vocabulary is carefully chosen. Call a safeguard bias, call a correction rigging, call a constitutional claim sour grapes. If fairness can be mocked as partisanship, manipulation can pass for common sense. Nuance matters here, and Fox works hard to erase it. Yes, both parties have drawn self-serving lines. No, the magnitude, methods, and consequences are not symmetrical. The question in any state is not who drew the map, but what does the math show? Do seats track votes within a reasonable band? Are communities cracked or packed beyond any civic rationale? Does the plan preserve minority opportunity districts required by law? Does the map improve or suppress competition over time? These are empirical questions with answers, not talking points with equal weight. There is also a human cost that never makes the chyron. When maps tell voters their voice won't matter, participation drops, constituent services drift toward the safe base, and policy hardens around what incumbents prefer rather than what majorities want. People learn the wrong lesson, not that the system needs repair, but that their citizenship is ornamental, that demobilization is a feature, not a bug, of extreme gerrymandering. A healthier frame is straightforward. Competitive districts wherever feasible. Transparent criteria published in advance. Public map submissions evaluated against clear metrics. Compactness, contiguity, community integrity, Voting Rights Act compliance, and a seat vote curve that stays within defensible bounds. Where politicians cannot or will not honor those basics, independent commissions do the job. None of this is radical, it is maintenance. What Fox sells instead is resignation. If every map is assumed rigged and every politician assumed corrupt, reform becomes a punchline and manipulation becomes the baseline. That is how the public is softened to accept a politics where politicians choose their voters and then call it democracy. The remedy is not louder grievance, it is clearer standards, honest math, and the stubborn insistence that representation should be earned in elections, not manufactured on a drafting table. 15. Law and Order as Spectacle. Fox's primetime crime story is staged as a nightly cliffhanger, America on the brink, order collapsing, only brute force can save it. The choreography is deliberate, open with sirens and grainy surveillance, cut to flames and smashed glass, roll the B-roll of tactical teams in body armor, helicopters raking the sky, agents swooping in where liberal mayors allegedly failed. Fear sharpens attention. Outrage holds it. Authority in costume supplies the payoff. Viewers are given the sensation of decisive, not the substance of it. That aesthetic of crisis has policy gravity. On air, troop deployments and tough-on-crime raids are praised as evidence of true leadership. The camera turns crackdowns into victory parades and, in doing so, pressures mayors and governors to choose the 8R over the slower work that actually reduces harm. When National Guard convoys rolled through Memphis in 2025, Fox framed it like a military triumph, looping dramatic footage of armor on city streets and teams kicking in doors. Off-screen, the city's own data showed homicides at a 4-year low and violent crime trending down. Also off-screen, a police department asking for detectives, analysts, mental health responders, and community trust initiatives. None of that makes gripping television. All of it makes communities safer. The network offers instead the dopamine of punishment, perp walks, mass arrests, tables of seized weapons. It glorifies the visible and neglects the essential, investigating cases, solving them, and building relationships that prevent the next act of violence. By flattening crime into a perpetual emergency, Fox teaches viewers to equate justice with aggression and to mistake restraint for weakness. The cost is invisible but profound. Short-term crackdowns trample local authority and constitutional limits, while the deeper drivers of disorder, poverty, trauma, addiction, distrust, fester unaddressed. This is the quiet exchange at the heart of the coverage. Policy gives way to pageant. Evidence gives way to adrenaline. Citizens are coached to cheer the feeling of control rather than demand the fact of safety. In the end, the story isn't really about public safety at all. It's about control, and about selling the fiction that spectacle fixes what only patient, accountable reform can. 16. Punishing enemies and the erosion of accountability. Fox's most corrosive achievement is to make conduct that should trigger bipartisan alarm look like ordinary governance. In the fog it manufactures, retaliation is sold as justice and force as virtue. Even two foundations of a free republic, an independent press and politically neutral law enforcement, are recoded as fair game. Retaliating against the press. In April 2025, a federal court found the White House had unlawfully retaliated against the Associated Press, cutting the outlet off from presidential events after reporting the administration disliked. The judge ordered access restored. Instead, the White House doubled down, AP reporters stayed barred, and a new pretext briefly excluded the wire services altogether. That is not a scheduling dispute, it is viewpoint discrimination against the press. In any healthy civic culture, the remedy would be swift transparency and compliance. On Fox, there was no campaign on behalf of press freedom, no caution about the First Amendment. The story simply slid past. The lesson modeled for viewers was grim and simple. When a newsroom challenges the leader, exclusion is acceptable. That is how authoritarian reflexes seep into the mainstream, not with a bang, but through partisan acquiescence, criminalizing rivals. For years, Donald Trump promised on Fox to lock up his critics. In 2025, the Justice Department charged former FBI Director James Comey on paper-thin felony counts, and primetime hosts hailed it as overdue payback. Courts treated it far less casually. Comey's counsel documented the president's public vendetta and constant calls for prosecution. A federal judge took the extraordinary step of scrutinizing the case as a possible vindictive prosecution. That phrase is not a talking point, but a due process doctrine reserved for cases where there is objective evidence that the state is punishing a person for exercising protected rights. Judges rarely entertain it. When they do, it signals danger. The machinery of justice may be serving a feud, not the law. Viewers were not asked to grapple with that threshold. They were invited to applaud that the deep state was finally getting what it deserved, targeting the vulnerable to teach a lesson. The impulse did not stop with political elites. Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a Salvadoran migrant, was deported in defiance of a court order. When that defiance surfaced, a judge ordered his return to the United States. Instead of complying, officials charged him with dubious smuggling offenses and tried to remove him again, even seeking to send him to distant countries that would not accept him. One federal judge found prima facie evidence of vindictive prosecution and opened an inquiry. Another criticized officials' candor and blocked the new deportation while legal challenges proceeded. These are extraordinary judicial rebukes. On Fox, where the case registered at all, the arc was flattened into a crackdown on an illegal immigrant, complete with insinuations of gang activity that defense counsel disputed. The audience was not asked to consider why a government would strain so hard to outrun a judge's order, or why doubling down after being caught is the tell of retaliation. They were handed another enemy and encouraged to cheer. The evidence shows concrete acts of retaliation. The guardrails are basic. The First Amendment's ban on viewpoint-based reprisals against the press, due process limits on vindictive prosecution, judicial orders that bind the executive. The breach is the choice to defy, blur, or weaponize those limits. Fox's framing either minimizes the breach, technicalities, red tape, or recasts it as courage, finally fighting back. The public lesson is corrosive. Punishment of disfavored people is justice. Resistance to punishment is proof of guilt. What gets erased is proportion and principle. Retaliation against a newsroom is not a process fight. It is a strike at the public's right to know. Prosecuting a rival under a cloud of personal vendetta is not hard-nosed. It is how equal justice bends into factional power. Ignoring a judge to force out a powerless migrant is not restoring order. It is a message to anyone who asserts legal rights: we will make it hurt. When this confusion hardens into mood, governance itself deforms. People unsure of what is real cling to what sounds decisive, mistaking the comfort of command for the substance of democracy. Fox's model exploits that instinct brilliantly. It converts anxiety into allegiance and substitutes motion for meaning. Viewers convinced they are defending liberty surrender it by degrees, to unchecked executive discretion, to the normalization of political prosecutions, to policies that elevate control over consent. The language of strength and patriotism does the quiet work of corrosion. Obedience is marketed as duty. Vigilance is dismissed as paranoia. The inversion of accountability is now explicit. In New York, Trump was convicted on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. In January 2025, he received an unconditional discharge, a sentence that affirms guilt while imposing no penalty, and the development was promptly reframed on Fox as exoneration, persecution, or both. The rule of law became another choose-your-own narrative. That is the point of the fog. A public trained to fear uncertainty more than unfreedom will trade both, and will call the trade strength. 17. A self-governing people should react very differently to the episodes above. Citizens, jealous of their liberty, defend a hostile press because tomorrow it may be their question that gets excluded. They demand prosecutors demonstrably insulated from a leader's grudges because today's target could be tomorrow's dissenter. They expect obedience to court orders, especially in cases involving the powerless, because that is the line between a republic of laws and a system of personal rule. Where Fox asks for applause, a constitutional public asks for receipts. The hazard is not theatrical, it is structural. Every unrebuked act of retribution becomes precedent, then habit. Each time defiance of a court order is shrugged off as toughness, the next defiance comes easier. Each time a prosecution cheered on television is revealed in court to be tainted by personal animus, and the revelation draws no consequence. Future prosecutors learn the same lesson. The system does not break all at once, it thins out. The norms that keep ordinary people safe, even people who will never attend a press briefing, stand in a dock, or face removal, are the first to go. What remains, after enough repetitions, is a country that remembers the rituals of freedom, but forgets the feel of it. Citizens still vote, still watch press conferences, still hear the word justice, yet decisions are made inside an atmosphere where punishment of enemies is virtue and restraint is weakness. That is not a temporary fever, it is a re-education in how to think about power, and it ends where it always ends, with a public trained to cheer its own demotion. 18. Anticipating the pushback and why it fall less flat. It's worth addressing a few predictable retorts to this critique of Fox News. Whenever Fox's methods are criticized, defenders, sometimes even the network itself, raise a series of familiar counter-arguments. Let's examine them. On the contrary, holding Fox News accountable for manipulation is not an attack on its audience's intelligence. It's an act of respect for their right to truth. If someone has been systematically misled, the moral failure lies not with the misled, but with those who engineered the deception. To expose that harm is to treat viewers as citizens capable of discernment, not as dupes to be pitied or mocked. Fox viewers have been profoundly let down, not because they are gullible, but because they placed their trust in an institution that monetized their good faith. The network's relationship with its audience is not one of information, but of dependency, fear for ratings, outrage for loyalty, confusion for control. Pointing that out is not contempt, it's a demand for honesty. A doctor doesn't insult a patient by diagnosing addiction, he does it to stop the harm. The same principle applies here. Critiquing Fox's manipulation isn't disdain for its viewers. It's a defense of their dignity, a reminder that democracy requires citizens who are informed, not conditioned. To call out propaganda is not to sneer at its victims, but to affirm that they deserve better than a steady diet of grievance and illusion. 19. No serious observer claims that journalism is free of bias. Every outlet makes editorial choices, what to emphasize, what to omit, how to frame complexity for a distracted public. But equating Fox News' business model with ordinary human bias is a profound misunderstanding of scale and intent. Most credible news organizations, whatever their slant, operate within a shared ethic: inform the public, verify facts, correct mistakes when they occur. Fox operates by an entirely different code, one in which bewilderment first, correction never isn't an accident but a strategy. Consider what we now know from Fox's own internal communications revealed in defamation suits. Producers and executives knowingly amplified falsehoods because truth was bad for ratings. Hosts privately mocked the same election conspiracies they promoted on air, yet continued to feed them to viewers. The motive wasn't ideology, it was addiction, keeping an audience agitated enough to never touch the remote. That is not bias. That is the deliberate substitution of narrative for knowledge, a business decision to monetize confusion. Yes, all outlets reflect perspective, but perspective, when handled responsibly, is anchored in verifiable fact and open correction. Fox's prime-time programming, by contrast, is a closed system, designed to provoke emotion, not understanding. Where others seek to clarify, Fox seeks to intensify. Where others issue corrections, Fox doubles down. The result is not merely a slanted worldview, but an alternative reality engineered for dependence. So no, both sides do it doesn't hold. Bias lives in the margins of interpretation. Fox's distortion lives in the marrow of its enterprise. The distinction is simple but crucial. One informs through imperfection, the other profits through illusion. This is just anti-conservative bias. You can't handle conservative perspectives. That charge mistakes the critique entirely. There is nothing inherently conservative about distortion, fear, or spectacle. In fact, traditional conservatism, at its best, rests on precisely the opposite virtues: order, truth, prudence, and moral restraint. Real conservatives have long warned against the populist temptations now amplified by Fox. Conspiracy in place of evidence, emotion in place of reason, outrage in place of judgment. To call that out is not an attack on conservatism, it's an act of fidelity to its core principles. The conservative tradition once championed measured leadership and respect for institutions, the idea that liberty endures only when power is bounded by law and truth. Fox's bewilderment. 20. Economy discards all of that. It trades careful stewardship for chaos, caution for spectacle, and constitutionalism for charisma. Its model doesn't conserve, it consumes, tearing down the very structures of civic trust that real conservatives once sought to preserve. What Fox sells is not conservatism but performance, an adrenaline-soaked populism that prizes combat over coherence. It encourages rash action over deliberation, rewarding those who shout traitor faster than those who test an argument. That's not a right-wing philosophy, it's a rejection of philosophy itself. So, no, this is not anti-conservative bias. It's anti-manipulation. Honest conservatism, like honest liberalism, is indispensable to a healthy democracy. But dishonest media that masquerade as its guardian while betraying the public's trust do violence to both. True conservatives, as much as anyone else, deserve a press that informs rather than inflames, that strengthens their judgment rather than exploits their fears. 21. The conservative case against the bewilderment economy. Rejecting Fox's confusion as power model isn't a matter of ideology, it's a matter of integrity. There is, in fact, a deeply conservative argument against it, rooted in the same values that once defined responsible right-of-center thought: fidelity to law, skepticism of concentrated power, and the belief that freedom depends on both order and truth. A movement that truly honors those principles should look at Fox's tactics: the constant crises, the moral panics, the elevation of force over restraint, and recognize something alien to its own tradition. Conservatism, properly understood, is about boundaries, constitutional boundaries that separate powers, moral boundaries that temper passion, and civic boundaries that protect local authority from federal overreach. Fox's worldview erases all of them. Its nightly theater of emergencies normalizes executive excess and glorifies militarized solutions to civic problems. It encourages citizens to mistake anger for strength and compliance for patriotism. The conservative temperament, cautious, disciplined, allergic to zeal, has been replaced by a populist hunger for spectacle. That shift comes at a steep cost. When media sell chaos as clarity, they train citizens to applaud the very abuses conservatism once feared. A government that acts without constraint, markets that tilt toward monopoly, and institutions hollowed out by opportunism. Fox's bewilderment economy doesn't conserve anything. It burns through civic trust to keep outrage profitable. If you still believe that the rule of law is sacred, that power should be limited and earned, and that truth is the foundation of freedom, then you already have a reason to reject this model. It is not a defense of conservatism, it is its undoing. Traditional conservatism rests on the premise that power, left unchecked, corrodes both liberty and order. It's why the Constitution dispersed authority among branches and between federal and state governments to ensure that passion never overran principle. Fox's narratives, however, treat those guardrails as inconveniences. Night after night, the network celebrates sweeping displays of federal and even military power as proof of leadership, rarely pausing to ask what authority permits such actions or whether the founders would have recognized them as constitutional. When Fox hosts cheer unilateral airstrikes on drug cartels or the deployment of troops in American cities, they're not defending law and order. They're normalizing executive adventurism. Under their telling, the president's will becomes synonymous with national strength, and congressional or judicial restraint becomes weakness. In this constant drumbeat of martial rhetoric, take the fight to them, do whatever it takes, show no mercy, the nuances of federalism vanish. A conservative faithful to first principles would stop the broadcast cold and ask, by what authority? Where are the limits? Those questions are the essence of the conservative temperament, skeptical of concentrated power, mindful of precedent, wary of haste. Yet Fox has inverted that ethic, urging a government that acts first and seeks permission, if ever, later. In doing so, the network has traded the conservative ideal of restrained governance for the allure of command and control politics, a vision of strength that mistakes dominance for discipline and erodes the very constitutional order conservatives once vowed to protect. 22. Conservatives have long upheld the principle that government works best closest to the people, that the strength of the republic lies in communities governing themselves without heavy hands from Washington. Yet Fox routinely abandons that creed the moment it clashes with its narrative of crisis. When footage from Chicago, Portland, or Memphis fills the screen, the call is not for local reform or community partnership, but for federal muscle. Agents in tactical gear, troops in the streets, a president finally taking control. These spectacles, framed as proof of resolve, are in fact the very centralization conservatives once distrusted. A DC takeover sold as patriotism. By portraying cities as irredeemable war zones and local leaders as incompetent or complicit, Fox primes its audience to welcome federal intervention they would have condemned a generation ago. When the network frames every local challenge as evidence of national decay, it invites national solutions, one-size-fits-all decrees that flatten the very diversity federalism was designed to protect. A conservative movement that once celebrated community self-governance now finds itself applauding top-down command, simply because the orders come from a president it favors. True Federalists should be uneasy watching these principles dissolve in the heat of spectacle. The belief in local authority was never meant to be situational, suspended whenever federal power wears a friendly face. But Fox's nightly theatrics encourage exactly that kind of selective conviction, autonomy when it embarrasses the left, obedience when it glorifies the right. It's a politics of convenience masquerading as conservatism, and it leaves behind not just hypocrisy but the hollow shell of a principle that once defined the movement's moral core. Free market conservatism has always been grounded in a simple conviction: competition disciplines power. Whether in business, media, or politics, monopoly breeds stagnation and corruption, while rivalry sharpens ideas and accountability. Yet Fox's treatment of gerrymandering and its own dominance in conservative media reveal how easily that principle is abandoned when power wears the right label. Gerrymandering is, at its core, political monopoly making. By slicing districts into mathematical absurdities, politicians insulate themselves from competition, guaranteeing victory regardless of performance. Fox rarely confronts this reality. Instead, it downplays the practice or reframes it as savvy strategy, even celebrating GOP-drawn maps as corrections to supposed liberal advantage. The result is a political marketplace where incumbents face no risk and voters no real choice, a command economy of representation. The contradiction deepens in the media sphere. Fox, once a counterweight to establishment voices, has become an empire unto itself, an information monopoly that crowds out the very intellectual diversity conservatism once prized. Center-right journalists who question party orthodoxy are pushed aside. Independent outlets are dismissed as disloyal. Viewers are told that dissenting conservatives are traitors, not competitors in a healthy exchange of ideas. In this closed loop, Fox acts less like a free market of thought and more like a cartel controlling supply. 23. True conservatives should see the irony. A movement that preaches competition cannot thrive inside an echo chamber. Innovation, whether in markets or in governing philosophy, depends on challenge, not conformity. When Fox substitutes debate with dogma, it dulls the creative tension that once made conservatism intellectually serious. If you believe in limited government, you should also believe in limited media monopolies. And if you believe in real markets, political or otherwise, you should reject any model, corporate or ideological, that exists to eliminate competition and call it strength. In the end, Fox's bewilderment model is not merely a betrayal of journalistic ethics, it's a betrayal of conservative philosophy itself. No movement built on the ideals of restraint, accountability, and ordered liberty can survive on a diet of spectacle and rage. A media culture that exalts confusion over comprehension inevitably produces the very outcomes conservatism once warned against: an unchecked executive, a hollowed-out Congress, a politics of impulse masquerading as strength. For a tradition that prides itself on prudence and skepticism of centralized power, Fox's model is a moral contradiction. It teaches citizens to mistake domination for discipline, loyalty for virtue, and outrage for principle. The irony is painful. In defending conservatism, Fox has helped erode the very foundations that make genuine conservatism possible. A government bound by law, a market open to competition, and a people capable of self-restraint. If conservatism is to mean more than partisanship with better branding, it must reclaim its old virtues from the noise. The first act of that recovery is to reject the bewilderment economy, to demand light where others profit from darkness. Only then can conservatives, and the nation as a whole, remember that the true test of strength in a republic is not how loudly one shouts, but how faithfully one thinks. 24. What ethical guidance looks like the litmus